When tweeting about this webinar, please make sure you use the hashtag ESConf so we can find and answer any questions you may have. So now I will hand you over to Fran and we can get started on today's topic. Good morning, Fran.
Good morning, Miriam. Thanks very much. And welcome to everybody on the webinar. I'm from Inspire Quality Services, and I've presented at EuroSTAR for the last 3 years tutorials on Agile testing. And the seed, I think, for this topic originated in those tutorials with test managers and test leads asking what happens to their role and what happens to the test management process in an Agile context. So this webinar is a kind of a cut-down version of a workshop I've done with the Soft Test, the Special Interest Group in Software Testing here in Ireland, and the UK TMF. And so hopefully it'll give some insights into the issues around Agile test management and test strategy and so on. Okay, so here's the agenda. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Agile. I'm going to talk about Scrum as an example, just because it's one of the most popular approaches from recent surveys I've seen. The organizations that are using Agile, about 70% of them or so are using Scrum, so it's very popular as an Agile method. But interestingly, it says very little about development and testing. So it's one of the issues, I guess, for test managers is, what happens to testing within the framework, for example, of a Scrum method. That's one of the things we're going to be talking about. Then I'll mention some of the challenges we've been coming across helping organizations transition to Agile from a testing perspective and particularly then from a test management perspective. And then I'll focus in just in the short time that we have on a few specific issues. Firstly, on the role of the test manager and what do you do in an Agile project, in an Agile organization, both from the point of view of a line manager and from the point of view of a project test manager. And then we'll look at the Agile test strategy and what the implications are for the test strategy in a Scrum or Agile framework. And then a few points around the test management process, like what happens to estimation and planning and what does it look like in Agile. And then finish up with a few conclusions and then hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end. So starting off with Scrum. Some of you may already be very familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, just very briefly, the idea is to work incrementally in cycles, for example, of 30 days. Some organizations have shorter cycles, but 30 days is fairly standard. And the idea is to have a number of roles in this approach, whereby you have a self-empowered team called the Scrum team, who are a cross-functional team of development types, programmers, DBAs, so on, architects, designers, and testers. So the tester is part of the team. They're not a separate entity, which is, I guess, the first key point that a test manager needs to be aware of. You're not going to be managing an independent system-level functional test team as you did in a normal sequential life cycle. There's a Scrum Master who's responsible for the Scrum process, and there's a product owner who represents the customer and is able to identify the requirements effectively and answer questions around those requirements. So the idea with Agile, of course, is to be pretty lean. So we don't write big requirement specifications. We have a product backlog which contains high-level descriptions of the user requirements, often called user stories, which are prioritized. Additionally, there may be other items in there. Some organizations put in bugs and put in other items that are going to generate work from a technical point of view. But the main content is the user stories and the prioritization of those user stories. Then when we come to a particular sprint, the idea is to allocate a number of those highest priority user stories to that sprint. Now, the higher level release plan will identify approximately in an outline roughly what user stories are going to be allocated to what sprints, and then over a period of time when you're planning to be doing a release. You're going to release it every sprint. More often I see organizations will release after a number of sprints when there's, let's say, a significant critical mass of functionality that makes sense, that adds business value and is sufficiently meaty enough basically to go through the release process. So that release plan will identify, say, in the first sprint that a number of user stories will be allocated. The team then break that down into the tasks they need to perform, both design and coding and testing tasks that need to be performed, test automation and so on. And then every day they meet on a daily basis, daily stand-up, which is a kind of a practice that has been used outside Agile team these days because it's so effective. and update each other on where they're at. Scrum Master facilitates these, but is not a project manager in the traditional sense. The team are self-empowered to make up their own decisions, to monitor and estimate themselves, and basically get the work done according to their definition of done, which I'll come back to later, which is a key point from a test manager's perspective to ensure that there's a strong definition of done and a clear definition of done across the Agile project teams. And then at the end of the sprint, when the stories are done, the idea is to demonstrate them to the product owner who represents the customer. Indeed, there may be actual customer stakeholders there, senior management and so on, and make a call on whether we're releasing at this point as planned in the release plan. During the sprint as well, of course, there is monitoring of tasks using task boards. There may be tools used for that, or it may simply be post-its on the wall. Talking about the user stories, tasks to be performed, and then whether they're in progress or to be tested and so on. And burn down charts are used, which is typically projecting the remaining work to be done. And at the end is a retrospective where we look at lessons learned and improve the way that we work, both from a development and test perspective. So that's in a very quick overview of some of the main elements within Scrum. So it's working incrementally. It's also working very iteratively. We're not working in mini waterfalls. The idea is that testing is done right from the start and throughout these sprints. And the developers and testers are doing testing rather than it being just a job of the tester to test, as we'll come back to in a minute. So that's a brief introduction to Scrum. Just on the topic of done, I just want to highlight this before I move on. It is a key point. It really effectively replaces exit criteria, and some of the weakest definitions of done that I've seen are that the developers say, well, I've done coding, and then the testers have to test it in the subsequent sprint. So that's a very, very weak and poor definition of done and not very effective. So typically what you want to see is working software. And for software to be working, it implies it has to be fully tested. It has to be tested at the unit level. You've got to potentially achieve structural coverage targets with that. These are just examples on this slide here. But at a higher level, you're looking for coverage of typical things like user story conditions. In the user stories, on the back of the card, for example, there's typically conditions of satisfactions, which are high-level statements of what will constitute acceptance by the product owner of that story, effectively the tests that have to be performed, written at a very high level, but they drive the higher level or acceptance test, as it's called. And so coverage of that is obviously key, potentially coverage of risks, defects, of course, non-functional aspects. Whatever, the team need to decide what an appropriate definition of done is, and indeed I'll talk about the role of the test manager in this as well shortly. Things that aren't done, stories that aren't done, basically get put back onto the backlog for the next sprint to be reprioritized and potentially included in work for the next sprint. I believe we have seen, in many cases, two levels of done, as I'll talk about later. Level of done for a sprint and level of done for a release, because sometimes it isn't practical to have absolutely everything done within the sprint. For example, some of the non-functional tests like performance or system integration issues sometimes are difficult to get done within a sprint by the team, particularly if you've got multiple Scrum teams working in parallel. You need integration points, potentially stabilization sprints, as I'll refer to later. Okay, so that's the definition of done. Test management challenges within Agile and Scrum. These are just a smattering of some of the issues with pitfalls we've come across. I think we're all aware of the fact that non-functional issues like performance often get pushed till the end and can cause problems, typically because user stories are very functionally driven. So often there isn't an upfront definition of the non-functional requirements that can then be prioritized along with some of the user stories. So that can cause problems, as well as from the point of view of the strategy for testing and where some of the non-functional tests are going to take place relative to the sprints, which is the point in the middle, I guess, as well, the ineffective incremental test strategy. So the test manager can play a key role in addressing some of these quality-related challenges, and a lot of these would be the concern of the test manager. Because the way that Agile works requires testing to be done right from the start and to have a strong ownership of testing by the developers as well as the testers. So for that to happen, developers need to be Doing unit testing, producing good quality unit tests, having automated unit tests. Test-driven development is a key practice from extreme programming that is often used by Scrum teams to augment their Agile practices. And obviously, it works very well in terms of producing robust software because of the fact that with continuous building integration, you can have continuous unit level testing because they're automated that can keep the system stable with all of the change that goes on in a highly iterative incremental life cycle, such as Agile. So these are some of the issues, but those tests can have problems. I've often seen unit tests that achieve good structural coverage, like 80% statement or branch or whatever. But yes, when you actually look at the code, there's actually no verification points. There's actually no tests taking place. They're just invocations of code. So you need buy-in from the developers. You need education of the developers on what constitutes good testing as well. Simply getting structural coverage, is good. Along with having good tests, it's not a be and end all on its own. Some of the key issues as well is sufficient customer involvement, and again, test managers need to ensure their testers are very closely aligned with the product owners, rather than being, let's say, driven by the implementation from the developer side. So you want that high-level testing to be driven off user stories and conversations with the product owner to ensure that testing is focused on that the customer need and business value, rather than implementation, which is what the unit tests will be covering. So again, I think that's a key point. But I'll come back to some of these issues as we go on. The role of the tester and test manager being one of them I'm going to talk about now. So some key considerations. Transitioning the test manager role is one that has come up, as I mentioned, quite a bit as you move to Agile. What do I do? There doesn't seem to be a role there for me as the test manager, as a test lead in Agile, according to the roles that we described there. So what is my role? Firstly, looking at from a line management or functional management perspective, if you were in charge or responsible for a number of, let's say, system-level testers, what do you do now? Well, a lot of those line functions are still completely relevant. The fact that your testers are actually seated within the Scrum teams doesn't obviate the need for, getting good testers, developing their careers, supporting those testers. So there's a responsibility on the test line manager to develop communities of practice as you transition to Agile, so that the testers can learn from each other. They can improve ways of working across the teams. So supporting the tester capability, obviously, hiring people, firing people. But the key thing, some people say in Scrum everybody needs to do everything. So the tester needs to be able to develop. In my experience, there are most of the organizations I see do not fire their system test team. What they do is those system testers bring a high level of professional expertise to a cross-functional team, and they work with the developers in a highly productive way. Obviously, when you're hiring new testers into an Agile team, you're going to look for the right set of skills that match the needs of that project. So, they obviously would include the ability to work alongside developers, and good communication skills, as well as potentially technical skills in the areas of test automation and so on, and experience of Agile. Developing the careers, performance management, as before. Training, coaching, mentoring, it was a key leadership role that test managers can play here, ensuring that the right process and culture is put in place, coaching the testers on the teams in those areas, supporting the specialist roles that are required to support the Agile teams as well, for example, such as performance and so on. But removing organizational obstacles. Scrum Masters are focused on removing obstacles within the Scrum teams. Line test managers should be responsible for taking a multiple project view across the organization and removing organizational objects. One of the ways, of course, that they do this is through the the definition and guidelines, I'll call it guidelines, for what a good test strategy should be in an Agile context, and supporting that overall quality, both on the development side, on the test side, in terms of the approach to automation, the tooling, and so on. So you're not going to create a big process guide and so on in Agile, but you do want to have some, cross-project standards. You want to set expectations for quality, non-functional aspects across projects. So this is a key role, and it needs to be proactive. And in my experience, sometimes there's been a lack of proactivity on the test side in defining these roles, in defining strategy, and ensuring quality as organizations transition to Agile. And as a result, I've seen many, many problems from a quality perspective because of the fact that there are many flavors of Agile. Many organizations saying they're doing Agile, but some of the practices, some of the key practices that will make it work in a particular context are not being used. And, in many cases, I would call it in the area of responsibility of Agile test management to ensure that those things are put in place. So being proactive in terms of the role and the strategy, I think, is a key point, a key responsibility of line management, test line management. Again, tools will be another area as well. Again, rather than taking the pure view, I guess, of Agile, where each team is totally self-empowered to do what it wants and select its own tools. In organizations, it's much more practical to have guidelines for tools that have been shown to work effectively in your context for your product within your environment. So rather than having a proliferation of different tools, it makes sense to be selecting those that are going to work best and give you the maximum return on investment in your context, be they open source or commercial. So again, this would be something that a test manager will be concerned with. In terms of the project test management, there are some significant differences there. Just like a project manager, there isn't the same requirement for a project manager. The role needs to change significantly. For example, some project managers become scrum masters, and I've also seen test managers become scrum masters. But that role becomes a facilitation role rather than a direct managing and monitoring type role. Estimation and planning are going to be done by the team now. Monitoring control is done by the team themselves. But obviously there is a need for higher level reporting and coordination and so on. Again, leadership, can involve getting directly involved, particularly in some of the larger projects, as a scrum master, for example, or as a team member, leading by example, and also developing the skills and developing the ways of working, for example, in some of those larger projects. But also in some of the larger projects, you can have the need for higher level planning coordination, the need for integration across multiple teams, coordination of system integration testing, reporting to senior management. Again, so as a project test manager, particularly in the larger projects, there's a need for what might be seen as some of those traditional type activities. Okay. So moving on then to Agile test strategy. This is typically what you see, as the core type of testing within a sprint. You're going to have user stories, and you're going to be developing what are called acceptance tests off that. Now, acceptance tests are not user acceptance tests as we knew them. They're more like a combination of customer-focused tests, with some traditional type system type tests. It's that kind of blend as appropriate in the context. Given that you've got hopefully good automated unit tests done by the developers, you will try and automate as much as possible at the higher level. So these higher level tests, call them acceptance tests, are going to be story based. They're going to be based on the conditions of satisfaction, driven by the product owner, supported by the testers. So the testers in the teams are going to be focused in this area. Are they manual or automated? Well, some may be automated. Mike Cohen, for example, talks about, has a very good view, I think, of the automation pyramid. At the lowest level, and the bulk of tests at the unit level will be automated by the developers. At the top level, you'll have your user interface automated tests, but the idea would be to have these as the smallest set of tests, given the fact that the user interface tests are usually those that are most brittle, that are most difficult to define up front. Typically, they're done later. So the middle layer is the key layer in Agile. It's the API type testing. It's the service type testing, where you define the tests based on the requirements, based on the user stories, but you don't draw it through the browser. You directly invoke the functionality of the system through the application programming interface. So they're the type of tests that allow you to automate up front from the start in Agile teams. And I think that automation pyramid that Mike Cohn talks about in his excellent book, Succeeding with Agile, is definitely the way to be looking at automation here. But obviously some tests can't be automated, or it doesn't make sense to automate them from the point of view of return on investment. So there is obviously a role for manual testing, potentially documented to a minimum lean level, but also exploratory testing, which is highly productive and therefore lends itself very nicely to Agile. In terms of test strategy then, this shows across sprints then. Okay, within sprints we've got the development and testing. Now this slide can be slightly misleading in that this may look like we're looking at mini waterfalls within each of the sprints. We're not. We're working in a very iterative way. So therefore we're looking at some development, some testing associated with a story that may run in parallel with other stories. It may be done overlapping. So it's very iterative rather than you do all of your design, then all of your coding, and then you've got a bottleneck of testing at the end of the sprint. What you want to be doing is testing throughout. So ideally some high degree of automation, but also whatever manual testing we've done throughout. But the previous slide is simplistic in that it just talks about unit testing and acceptance testing and manual exploratory. What about all the other risks? What about the non-functional areas? What about system integration? What about feature interaction, end-to-end scenario, et cetera, et cetera. So depending on what the risks are and what the types of testing that you need to do, you need to define as part of a strategy and as part of the release plan and your definition of done, where are you going to do this testing? So what we normally see, the most pragmatic approach to this is in the release plan, you're deciding where you believe you're going to be doing a release to the client. Maybe it's after sprint 3, maybe it's after sprint 4. So you're deciding as much as possible you want to do these types of tests within sprints up front at the time so everything is fully done and working. But there may be practical reasons for why some of these tests may happen later, but they may but obviously they need to be done prior to actual release. So it is the kind of the strategy should be as much as possible up front, but for practical reasons there may be reasons why you may have 2 levels of done, one for the sprint and one for the release. What you want to avoid is testing becoming the bottleneck at the end. Sometimes organizations use what are called stabilization sprints as well, whereby you do that system integration type testing and even customer UAT may be appropriate in supplier-client relationships and so on. But again, the test manager plays a key role in driving this approach forward. In terms of the process, then test management process, as I mentioned, a lot of the estimation, there is high-level planning and estimation in the release plan. So, an example of a very high-level release plan just shows the various sprints, the stories or items within the product backlog that are being allocated across the sprints. All of the work that needs to be done to implement those includes development and testing. And you're assuming some kind of productivity, often called a velocity, often measured in story points. I don't have time to go into that here, but it's a relative sizing technique, just to allow you to give a high-level view of what you can get done and achieve and be productive to what level of productivity what you can get done for each of the sprints. Now, obviously, you will adapt and adjust that based on the actual productivity that you observe at the end of sprint 2. So the team use the feedback from their productivity to calibrate what they take on.
We are having some technical difficulties at the moment, people, but if you bear with us, we'll get Fran back on the line again.
Thanks a lot. Okay, apologies everyone. Apparently my broadband has just died, and my phone was on that too. So Murphy's Law, as they say. So I'm going to continue just talking. I can't see the updates on the screen, but I'll continue just to finish off the presentation. Mariam will, I think, will flick forward. So I'm on the slide. I was talking about the sample release plan, and I was really just talking there about how, from a higher estimation point of view, it's just part of the overall estimation. It's not separated out. That's the key point. So if we move on to the next slide, which is slide 15, This just spells that out in more detail. Test estimation is done as part of story estimation in terms of story points, typically for the backlog, so you can then allocate them across sprints for the release plan. And then each sprint then, the team do their own identification of tasks and estimation of those tasks, and testing is just one of those tasks as part of the team. They often use a review technique like planning poker, which is based on the Delphi technique, and using the Fibonacci sequence to estimate, for example, the number of hours per task as a team, iterate that until there's consensus. So really, the testing just gets integrated. Estimation of testing tasks just gets integrated into the estimation of all the other tasks. So from that point of view, there is no kind of role within the sprints for a test manager planning and estimation. So if you move on to the next slide, slide 16. The IEEE 829 test plan. So as a test manager, you are not going to write an IEEE 829 test plan in most Agile contexts because, as we say, there are those three levels of planning. There's a release planning, which will be lightweight. There will be elements of that high-level approach implicit in the release plan because, for example, you may have stabilization sprint where you do some of those testing activities we mentioned. Such as performance and so on, system integration. So there'll be the sprint planning, which is done by the team, and then there'll be the daily adaptation of those estimates and plans by the team themselves as part of the updating of the task board. So a lot of those kind of those three levels of planning substitute for the need for the detailed planning in an IEEE 829 test plan. Similarly, items like what to test, what not to test is covered by the story conditions, by the definition of done, by the feedback you get from the demos, and so on. So this slide just talks about how the thought process is totally valid that you go through in planning, but the actual documentation of the output of that thought process is going to be different in an Agile context, and it'll be more distributed, and it'll be much more adaptive. You'll be changing it on more of an ongoing basis, and the responsibility for doing this is distributed within the team. So moving on to slide 10, slide 17, it is a summary of the some of the key points. So key benefits of Agile are incremental development that allows you to accept change readily. It allows you to deliver potentially earlier. And from a test perspective, we're particularly interested and focused on the fact that at each of these increments we have working software. So the definition of done is hugely important, and the role of the test manager in defining that is key. And so there is a mindset change. There's the role of the tester and test manager much more integrated with the team. There can be a cultural change there, obviously. And test and test managers need to be much more proactive in defining their role, in defining the test process and test strategy and so on in an Agile context, so that you end up with high productivity but with high quality as well. And there is key collaboration with customers, business drives priority, and testing gives you the feedback and decision support. So that's really a summary. So apologies again for the breakdown at the point there. And that's pretty much from the slides. I don't know if we have time for any questions. Miriam, can you, I can't see any but because I don't have the connection, but do you have any questions there?
I'm just waiting for a few now, Fran, but I'd like to thank you for getting over those gremlins and thank everybody for their patience. Everybody sit on the line. So now if you have any questions, you can just enter them with the Q&A tab. Thanks a million, Fran.
No problem at all. No problem at all. One that just while we're waiting, one that I often get asked is what about the level of test documentation that we should be planning for in Agile? Well, obviously, if the higher the amount of automation that you have, the more that the tests will be just documented as part as the automated tests. But organizations do write manual tests. That's the reality. Sometimes it's hard to automate. Sometimes it's not cost effective. So in those manual tests, typically you want to distinguish between what is being tested versus how to do that test, the procedural elements. So typically Agile teams write test cases, but they tend not to write procedural information, or maybe only write procedural information if there's added value in doing that. Maybe it's high risk, maybe it's an aspect you will be automating subsequently, that type of thing. Obviously, exploratory has its own approach. I'd recommend you have a look at session-based test management as a test manager to be able to focus and report on the scope of the exploratory testing sessions as part of the overall test strategy.
Thanks very much, Fran. I think you've done such a great job that we don't have any questions today for you.
No worries, no worries.
So thanks very much for a great presentation, and thank you again for everybody for having the patience to hold on while we got over our little gremlins. Fran will also be speaking at this year's conference. Oh, I think we might have a question now actually for you, Fran. Okay, this is from Sue. Will you mail the presentation to the participants? I suppose if you give us your email, Fran, you might be able to do that.
Absolutely, no problem.
Problem.
My email is on that last slide, or you can contact me directly, but or else just if you give your email to Miriam, I can send you that presentation, no problem. Yes. There's also, I believe, a downloadable version, slightly different version from on the softtest.ie website as well, from the workshop I did there. But I can send you this one directly if you send your contact details to Miriam.
Thanks, Fran. So they can email me. That's Miriam at EuroSTARconferences.com. That's MIRIAM at EuroSTARconferences.com. And I will forward your email on to Fran. Now, we have Catherine says, thanks a lot for this presentation. And then we have one from Thomas. Stakeholders often want precise estimates. Now, I don't know what his question is there.
Yeah,
well, you might know.
Yeah, it's an issue, basically. Yeah, that's the trouble. There is a cultural shift. There's a need for customer buy-in to a new way of working. Because Agile says, basically, we're going to fix time, we're going to fix budget, we're going to fix quality. So what we're going to vary is scope. So working incrementally, we will have a high-level plan and view of that, but the idea of Agile is not to do detailed estimation and say we will have a fixed scope that will be delivered on that date, to that budget at that quality. So that is a mindset shift for customers and other stakeholders to get their heads around, and it's not easy to convince them that this is a better way of working. So what often happens, for example, in fixed price contracts is, you just have to do it. So you do have to do a hybrid. You do have to do your traditional long-range detailed planning and then work within that in an agile way, work incrementally in sprints within that so that you work in a highly productive way, producing high-quality software within the framework of fixed scope. So I often see that too, but it eliminates one of the key benefits of Agile, which is the ability to embrace change, and the ability, because if you have a fixed scope, changes are handled through a change request system, and the customer is going to have to be charged for that and penalized for that because you have a baseline you're working against. So, there are big advantages to the customers to thinking about working in a different way, in an Agile way, and that reduces the need for the long-term detailed estimation.
Okay, thank you, Fran. Thomas has one more thing to add. He says, how can we estimate exploratory testing?
Well, I think it's not so much an estimation as an allocation of effort and time associated with it. Like you want to look at coverage. So your definition of done should tell you what you need to cover. Your approach to automation and manual documented testing as part of your strategy is going to cover certain elements, and certain other elements won't be covered. You'll be leaving to exploratory. So, for example, you might automate through the APIs, but that means you're not testing any business logic in the user interface. So you would use exploratory to do that. You would estimate then, the kind of testing that will be required to do that. Using section-based test management, obviously you can plan for, a number of sessions per day, a number of people doing it who are experienced, and you're managing the focus and the scope of each of those sessions using section-based test management and reporting at the end of each of those sessions. The estimation of, how long you should spend in that, I agree, is a little fluid, and it's based on what kind of coverage you want to get from those exploratory sessions relative to the coverage you're going to get from the other types of testing. So it is highly productive in terms of fault finding. It's been shown in research to find about 4 times more faults per hour of testing than structured testing, documented testing. So it is highly productive from that point of view. So you just have to consider, I guess, and I guess there is also the element of, in Agile, you use the feedback of, well, how long did it take us to explore a certain area and get a degree of coverage in exploratory, and use that information to calibrate your estimate for the next sprint. So, the first time around, it is going to be a little bit hit or miss in terms of the estimates, but the idea is your estimation gets better because you're using the feedback from each of the sprints.
Great. Thanks very much, Fran. That's all the questions we have for the moment, so we can wrap it up. Thanks to everybody for attending. I hope you can join us tomorrow as we are screening a very special video of the Super Testers by Anna and Linda Hoff. That was filmed live at EuroSTAR 2010. If you would like to register for this year's conference, please visit our website for more details. And finally, I'd like to remind you all that this webinar has been recorded, and we will email you once it is available in the EuroSTAR webinar archive. Thank you for listening. This webinar has now ended.